So, you're in the market for a Bible, huh? Well, let me see if I can help you make a decision. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the ESV Concise Study Bible and the CSB Everyday Study Bible. And by the time we're done, you should have a better understanding of which of these two wonderful Bibles is the right pick for you. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so I'm excited for this comparison. These are two wonderful Bibles that I have had to make the decision on myself. And by the end of the video, I'll let you know which of these two I chose and why. But ultimately, who cares about me? This is about what's best for you. So I'll also give my thoughts about, who I think each of these Bibles are for. Now, to make this comparison at least somewhat objective, I will be comparing these Bibles in 10 categories, 10 areas, and subjectively deciding which wins in each area. So I'll be, objectively subjective or subjectively objective. I don't know even how to say that. I'm just confused. But I'll try to make this not confusing for you. So here are the 10 categories that we're going to cover. So let's just get this thing going with category 1, because this is already going to be a long video. And that's going to be translation and text type. So, starting with the ESV, and let me get this pulled up. The ESV is a refresh of sorts, but it's much more than that. They refreshed the RSV. It's been billed as basically an essentially a word-for-word translation. Now, there are other word-for-word translations that are considered more literal, if you will. This is at least according to Wesley Huff's website. The ESV is generally a little more readable, and that was kind of their intention, to make it a little more readable as far as literal translations go. The CSB is basically, I'll pull this up as well. The CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, is basically a revision of the Holloman Christian Standard Bible, which was originally translated and then released back in 2004. It's based on the same critical text that the ESV used, but it was intended to be easier to understand than a word-for-word translation. They use what they call, I don't know if Wesley Huff says it on here. Yeah, they claim it as a dynamic equivalent, but if you go to the CSB website, they call it an optimal equivalence. So they try to basically bridge the gap between the formal equivalence here, the word for word, and the dynamic, which is the thought for thought. The CSB is trying to bridge that gap there, and you can see, at least according to Wesley Huff, it's kind of, pretty close to the ESV on this whole translation spectrum, if you will. So that's the translation, the text type of these. Now, no translation is going to be without its critics, of course. These translations aren't infallible. They aren't inerrant. They are man's attempt to translate the original, to make it understandable to us. So I do want to just for a moment here highlight the most common sort of complaints against each of these Bibles. So as far as the ESV is concerned, the top 5 complaints, at least according to ChatGPT, they are, number one, that it's overly literal and therefore it can be hard to read. That's a complaint. Number 2, they say that there's controversial gender language choices. Sometimes they will stick to the more literal, saying something's brother rather than, what the context might suggest, where it would be like brothers and sisters. The ESV will tend towards the literal translation of that, and that can cause some gender language, controversies or whatever. Number 3 would be the perceived theological bias of the English Standard Version. Basically that it's a kind of a reformed translation of the Bible. The number 4 complaint is that the 2016 revision brought controversy in certain word choices. And then number 5, as far as controversies, is there can be a loss of nuance when handling more ambiguous passages from, translating from the original. So those are the top 5. And I'll just say that I have heard most of those arguments against the ESV. So I would say, at least in regards to the ESV, ChatGPT's summation of their complaints seems to be pretty spot on. So let's go and look at the top 5 complaints against the CSB. And the number 1 there would be gender language decision. So kind of the other side of the spectrum from the ESV. Whereas the ESV was literal in their translation of the gender, the CSB has kind of gone a little more inclusive where, maybe when the original says brother, but the context would suggest brother and sister, the CSB would use brother and sister, right? So those gender language decisions. Number 2 was that their translation philosophy and a perceived compromise in there. Some people are just not fans of kind of this optimal equivalence or the dynamic equivalent philosophy, right? It's too thought for thought rather than word for word. Number 3 would be the perceived inaccuracies in the translation. Again, that's going to probably happen with all translation, especially when you go away from word to word into more thought for thought. People are going to not be fans and think there might be inaccuracies there. Number 4 is that there's a theological or a denominational slant to the Christian Standard Bible, because I think Holloman is like a Southern Baptist sort of organization, so they might perceive this as having a Southern Baptist slant to the translation. And then number 5, the last complaint is that the language is too modern or it's too plain. It lacks some of that more traditional language. Now, again, I have heard some of these complaints myself, so I think they're accurate. But, I do think that regardless of which translation you land on, you will hear some of these complaints for both of them. So those are things you're just going to have to understand. And every Bible translation has complaints against it. So that's nothing uncommon there. It doesn't mean they're bad translations at all. It just means people complain. That's what we do, right? So when it comes to sort of scoring this area, translation and text type are number 1 category. I'll have to just give them both a point, because really translation comes down to the individual reader. Both translations are good. There's a wealth of scholarship on both sides of the translation table here for both Bibles. You can be confident that both are good. They're just different. So it just kind of depends on what your needs are. And again, we're going to discuss that later in the video. But as far as declaring a winner in the translation or text type, I'm just going to have to give a point to both and call it a tie, because they're both good. They're just different. So with that being said, we're now going to transition away from looking at me. We're going to jump over to my table with a sheet on it so that we can take a closer look at these Bibles and see, how they're laid out, all the sort of differences of how the Bibles are, printed, packaged together, and all that sort of stuff. So let's jump over to the sheet and we'll get into category number 2. All right, so over here now on the table with a sheet on it, let's take a look at the binding and durability of these 2 Bibles. So I have a paperback ESV Concise Study Bible, and then a leather touch CSB Everyday Study Bible. Now, the reason for this choice was really pricing. These 2 options were the least expensive and most readily available option as far as these 2 Bibles were concerned. And we'll be discussing that as far as pricing and all that in just a bit. So as far as binding and durability is concerned, between the two options, the CSB is going to win here. And I'll just take this cover off because it's the leather touch option. But let's take a second and go and look at what options are available between these two Bibles. So first, the Everyday Study Bible, it does come in leather touch, which is what I have, but they also have a hardcover version and a bonded leather version. The ESV Concise Bible, on the other hand, it comes in the paperback version, a hardcover version, and a leather touch option if you want that as well. So because there's an actual leather version of the Everyday Study Bible, it's going to win in the category of binding and durability because it has the best option as far as binding, and leather is going to be more durable than paperback or leather touch. So category number 2, binding and durability, we're going to give the win to the CSB Everyday Study Bible. Category number 3 now, the font size and readability. So as for the ESV Concise, it uses a 7.75 font for the main text and a 6.5 font for the study notes. Now that's pretty small font. I have pretty good eyesight and I can read the text fairly well. However, what makes the Bible, so if you have less than, stellar eyesight, that could be a challenge for you. But it's not that bad. The font being a bit small isn't that bad. What makes this less readable is actually the paper's thinness. I don't know if this translates through on the camera well. Let me see if I can get to the end of a letter here. I can probably turn these pages. Like here at the end of Ezekiel, if you guys can see that, I'm not sure if the camera will pick it up, but it bleeds through pretty well. So, if you're like a highlighter, you like to underline or mark up your Bibles, the letters bleed through pretty well there. And that could make it challenging, again, maybe depending on your eyesight or the lighting in the room. I'm not really sure, but the smallness of the font is less of a problem than the thinness of the paper that's allowing for bleed through. Now with the CSB, they use a 9.5-inch font for the main text, and I'm not sure what the study note text is, but it is smaller than the main text. They also use a thicker paper. So let me see if I can get a single page here opened up. These Bibles are brand new, so I haven't really broke them in at all, but not sure if you can see that there. This paper's a little bit thicker, it seems, and so the bleed through is not quite as bad. I mean, it's still there, certainly, but it's not quite as bad. And I also like and want to make note that the background of the study notes section is highlighted, which I think just makes it more easily definable, whereas with the ESV Study Bible, they didn't do anything like that. It's just a separator line and then the study notes down at the bottom. So as far as I would say readability is concerned, again, I'm going to have to give it to the CSB Everyday Study Bible, that it's just easier to read. The text is a little bit bigger. The pages seem a little bit thicker, and that sort of multicolored background on the study notes section just makes it easier to discern. So again, as far as font size, readability, I think the win is going to go to the CSB Everyday Study Bible. Now let's move on to category number 4, the page layout and design. So both of these Bibles here, let me get it opened up. Both of these Bibles here, they are printed out in that double column format with the references down at the bottom and the study notes below the references. Again, like I mentioned, the ESV study notes are separated by a separator line, whereas the CSB, they just have the study notes in this, gray background section that helps it to stand out from the main text. As for the margins and the spacing, neither of them have a ton of space, but I think the ESV, if you guys can, maybe if I can line these up together a little bit closer, if you can see, the ESV does seem to be slightly smaller. So if you are a note taker, you like to write notes in your Bible, that sort of stuff, we're kind of splitting hairs here, but it seems like the CSB is going to have a little bit more space than the ESV Concise Study Bible. And then as far as things like paragraphs and headings and that sort of stuff, the ESV's headings, if you guys can see this, they're not quite as discernible as the CSBs. I mean, they're certainly there. I mean, you can see them as we're, looking down here. You can see that there are paragraph headings marked, but they're harder to see. Again, if you're in low light conditions, or maybe your just eyesight isn't as strong as it once was, this could be a problem if you care about paragraph headings. On the CSB though, the clear, bolded paragraph headlines just make it much easier to separate and discern from the main text. So here again, in regards to page layout and design, I'm going to have to give the point to the CSB Everyday Study Bible. Having the study notes in this gray background, again, marginally slightly wider margins, and just a more discernible sort of paragraph heading, I think gives it the win in the whole, layout and design of the Bible. So that's category number 4. Let's move on to category number 5. So here we'll talk about the study features that each of these Bibles have. So we'll just flip over here to the back of the ESV Concise Study Bible. And on here it says that they have over 12,000 study notes, over 150 maps and charts, over 15 illustrations, over 12 articles that introduce the readers to the Bible and the Christian faith, plus a glossary and a concordance. So they got plenty of maps, plenty of charts. However, it doesn't actually have like a dedicated maps section at the back of the Bible, like is typical in most Bibles. It's more, if you see this, it's more spread out throughout the Bible. So as you flip through, they'll have their maps and all this other stuff scattered throughout the text or throughout the Bible. So that's something to consider. As far as introductions, so they do offer pretty good introductions here in the ESV Concise, like 2 to 3 page book introductions for each book, which is really good for a concise study Bible. It also offers, and let me see if it lists it here. It does also offer like introductions to the Old and the New Testament, plus introductions to the Pentateuch specifically. And then the articles that it has, they tend to provide you with more like what seems like kind of general or basic teachings on the Christian faith. So that should be better for like younger or maybe newer Christians as far as the articles that they have written in here. And I haven't searched out every single article to read them, but just from the headings, Scripture in the canon, God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, God's plan, sin and salvation, those sorts of things. I will mention that they have a pretty good, they do have a glossary in here, which is nice. And the concordance is pretty good, 53-page concordance, I believe. in the ESV Concise Study Bible. So that's the study notes provided here. And I'm not going to go into the individual notes that are provided. Again, both of these Bibles were translated by wonderful scholars. The notes are going to be pretty solid. But as far as the ESV or the CSB Everyday Study Bible, looking on the back of the sleeve here, they have articles from Bible scholars. They have 99 essential Christian truths. They have Bible character profiles, charts, illustrations, and images. And I will mention, it does say down here, full color maps and a concordance. So in this Bible, they have in the back of it 7 pages of colored maps. Again, where you would expect maps to be. And again, having color is nice there. They do have a 50-page concordance in the back of the Bible. So if you want to look things up, they do have a concordance there. There's no glossary, but they do have something that I think is really cool in here. They do have multiple Bible reading plans already in the back of the Bible. So if you're looking for a Bible reading plan to follow. And then something else that I thought was really cool, if I can find it. They have a scripture memory in here, but then they have this. They have a harmony of the Gospels included in this Bible, which is great because the CSB sells a separate Harmony of the Gospels book, and you can get a slightly condensed version of that here in the Everyday Study Bible. So I really like that. The book introductions, however, are a little bit smaller. They're typically 1-page introductions. That's it. But it does offer, and I think this is kind of cool what they do. They do have like the Old Testament introductions. Sorry, trying to navigate this upside down here. They do have Old Testament introductions. If I can find it, and I don't know if it says it necessarily in here. So they have an Old Testament introduction, an introduction to the Pentateuch, and then when you get to the New Testament, they have it broken out as an introduction to the Gospels and Acts. If you can see this here, the New Testament introduction to the Gospels and Acts. But then when you get past Acts, it has a separate introduction to the letters. So introduction to the New Testament letters. So I think that's pretty cool, a cool way to break this out. And then the articles that it includes in this Bible seem geared, more towards like expanding your Christian knowledge rather than sort of building on the foundations or building a foundation of your Christian knowledge. Things, geez Louise, I cannot navigate this. Things like, character profiles and then these 99 essential Christian truths. I think those kind of articles are more expanding your Christian knowledge rather than just building a foundation. So I think that's kind of neat. Now, this is certainly going to be subjective, but since I'm the one doing the grading, if I have to give a point here, I'm going to give it to the CSB Everyday Study Bible for the features that it provides, because both of these are going to provide a wealth of biblical knowledge. But I just typically find the CSB study material more useful. Simple things. I like the colored maps at the back. You know where to find them. I think having a harmony of the Gospels is a really neat feature to have in a small condensed study Bible like this. And then I even like breaking out the introductions the way they did it, to where it's like a Pentateuch, the Gospels, Acts, plus the letters. I just find that very neat and useful, even though I would have liked to seen their introductions a little bit longer like they were in the ESV. But if I have to give a point out, they're both great, but I will give the point to the CSB Everyday Study Bible. So, they technically should be both wins because they're both great, but since we have to give a point out, we'll give a point out. So let's move on now to category number 6 and look at the additional features that these Bibles have. So not a lot here to discuss, but with the ESV Concise Study Bible, at least the version that I have, there's almost no additional features whatsoever. There's no red lettering in here. There's no bookmarks. There's no ribbons. It's just black and white on paper, basically. The CSB Everyday Study Bible, on the other hand, does offer, again, those colored maps in the back. It's a small thing, but it does offer those. It does offer 2 ribbons, which is pretty nice, on even one of the more inexpensive leather touch versions. So, that's just, I think, not a lot of additional features, but that's nice. And again, we talked about things like Harmony of the Gospels, which could be considered an additional feature, and, articles, but I would consider that study material. So if we're going to grade these on additional features, there's not a lot, but the CSB does have some. So we will have to give the point there to the CSB Study Bible with the additional features. So moving on here to category number 8, let's discuss the size and the portability of these 2 Bibles. So the ESV Concise is a good deal smaller and lighter. I believe this Bible, at least the economy version, comes in at 1.8 pounds, whereas the Leather Touch CSB Everyday comes in at 2.6 pounds. And, I'm not sure what the weight difference would be if we had a Leather Touch here or the genuine leather hardcover, whatever. But for the ones I have, it's almost a pound difference. And, that's a pretty significant difference when you're talking about, a book that you would carry in your hand. Now, so again, let me just set these up so you guys can see them. The Everyday Study Bible is significantly bigger than the Concise Study Bible as far as width and height. And while the CSB is bigger width and height wise, what I think is more interesting is that, this Bible, this Concise Study Bible, has about 1,530 pages. The Everyday Study Bible has 1,730 pages roughly, but they're both about the same thickness, which is pretty fascinating. Having 200 extra pages, and, we saw that at least, with this Leather Touch version compared to the paperback version, it's not like the pages are way thicker in the Concise, because the bleed through and everything on the Everyday Study Bible is better. So it's fascinating that though it weighs more, it's bigger, as far as thickness is concerned, they're pretty much the same. So I think that's really interesting there. It's just kind of a strange result. So that's, size, weight. But one thing I want to mention on the idea of portability is while this ESV Concise is smaller and lighter, at least with the paperback version, it's not quite as easy to manage. Like let's say you're going to a coffee shop, and you want to flip the Bible open to read. It's not going to really just lay there. I mean, you're going to have to put a lot of work into bending this thing and getting it worked in, or you're just going to have to hold it. Whereas, the Leather Touch, it's going to hold, lay flat a little bit easier, the CSB Everyday Study Bible. So while it's bigger, while it's heavier, not necessarily thicker, I would consider this a feature of portability, that you could just set the Bible on the table and for the most part, just kind of open it up and read it without having to sort of finagle it or put something on it or hold it down. So I think, in that respect, I'm going to call this a tie. I want to give winners, but I think The thickness is the same. The size is smaller on the ESV Concise, but it's less manageable. So if you're going out on the road, out to a coffee shop, this slightly bigger Everyday Study Bible, which is not big at all, but it's easier to manage. So I think that is a tie for, I think that was category 7 actually, size and portability. Now we're on to category 8 here, price and value. So let's talk about the price and value of these two Bibles. Now, both of these are going to be widely available online, but in my experience, both are going to be somewhat hard to find in store. And they're both pretty similar on price. So the CSB Leather Touch that I have, it was $17 on Amazon. The hardcover was $30 on Amazon, but if you go to a different online store like christianbook.com, both the Leather Touch, the hardcover, they're both about $20. But again, remember, there is the bonded leather version of the CSB Everyday Study Bible, and that one runs about $50 on Amazon or Christian Book. Now, the ESV, this is challenging, Concise paperback is $12 on Amazon. It's $26 for the hardcover and the Leather Touch. And again, there is no genuine leather option here. And whether you're on Amazon or Christian Book, the pricing is about the same. So as far as affordability goes, I'll have to give the nod to the ESV Concise. Since the paperback version, if you search around, I think the Westminster bookstore, you can find these under $10. However, when we look at, so that's affordability, but when we look at cost versus quality, I would have to give the nod to the CSB Everyday. I mean, for $17, you get a Leather Touch, pretty rugged, multicolored Bible, 2 ribbons. Like, that's just a really incredible value for the amount of study material, extra features that you get in here. And I think it's worth just pausing for a minute to thank God that we live in a land where God's word is so readily accessible and for such a modest cost. I mean, these are, regardless of how the competition shakes out, wonderful, wonderful Bibles and spiritual resources. And you can get them both almost for under $30. That is incredible. So praise God for that. So while the ESV can be found cheaper, the cost versus quality of the CSB, I think, means that we will have to call it a tie here in this category as well, a point to each. So that takes us down to our final 2 categories. And category number 9, we're going to look at the target audience. So both of these Bibles are targeting kind of a general audience with the intention of being like everyday general use Bibles. They're both sort of like all age appropriate as well. But in my opinion, I would say that the target audience for the ESV Concise, I think, would be someone new to the faith. And that may seem odd, since it's the more literal translation. But it's my opinion that if you are new to the faith, you should be really focused on building a solid foundation with a good word-for-word translation. And then if you want to veer off into the more, thought-for-thought realm, I think that'll give you a better understanding as to why the thought-for-thought decisions were made, because they were made for a reason. It's like being in school. If I'm going to teach you how to do division, or, if I'm going to teach you math, I'll teach you division by hand before I give you a calculator, right? You're kind of teaching that foundation, and that's what I think a word-for-word translation can do. Now, the second person I think the ESV Concise would be a better fit for is someone who desires to have a kind of more academic reading or more academic understanding of the Bible. And look, that's not for everyone, and it shouldn't be for everyone. If you're just a church member that, you don't have a desire to teach or lead in the church, then you don't really need to have this academic understanding of the Bible. However, if you are desiring to teach or lead, then you should be. And I think in that case, this might be a really good option for you. Now, as for the CSB Everyday, I think this Bible is great for someone that has probably been in the faith for a while and has a solid grasp on the fundamentals of the faith and a good grasp on Bible translation. So you know why translations are the way they are, the decisions that they make. I think that's very helpful. Maybe you know how to use sort of the references down in the bottom to be able to search to see what the translations were doing and why. But you just want an easier reading or an easier read through of the Bible. So that's why you would go for this more optimal equivalent, translation over a word for word that can be a little bit more of a chore at times to read through. And secondly, I would say if you're looking to maybe move on from an older, maybe more out-of-date transition, a KJV kind of Bible, and you want something that's more of a refresh, well, this would be a really good option to sort of move into a modern translation. I think the CSB it's a good translation, a lot of very sound scholars behind it, just with a modern, more contemporary flair than say a word-for-word ESV translation. So, as far as like the target audience is concerned, again, both are really good. I'm going to give a point to both in this category because, depending on what category you fall in doesn't mean you're better or worse than the other category. If you're just a casual reader, a Christian lay member in the church, or a, pastor, future pastor, something like that, that's no better or worse than the other. So I think it just depends on where you are and what your needs are that this Bible will fit. Of course, they're both good Bibles. They can both cross over into the other camps, but I'll give a point to both because, the general audience is just going to determine on where you are in life. So that was point number 8. Let's move on here. That was point number 9. So we're on to our last category here, the final category, category number 10, and that's going to be my overall impressions. So first for the ESV Concise. Now again, this is the paperback, so the overall impression would probably be different with other versions. But my overall impressions is that it seems kind of purpose-built for the audience that I think it fits best. It feels almost like an academic paper or an academic textbook when you open up to read it. It's bland, it's boring, it's black and white, and it's just jam-packed and, bursting with information. Like, have you ever read a doctrinal research paper? They're just like 100 pages crammed full of information. And that's what this Bible feels like to me. Now, I love the ESV as a translation. I've read the ESV for years. I have the ESV study Bible. But this Concise study Bible, it's like steak and potatoes. It's nothing flashy. It's nothing sexy, but it's filling. So that's what I see. It's an academic research paper. It's steak and potatoes, nothing really flashy. That's my overall impression. With the CSB Everyday Study Bible, the experience or my impression, it's a lot different. To me, this feels like a modern Bible. That it's kind of working hard to, capture the attention, to engage with its reader. I feel like it's almost like it knows that its information is valuable. It just wants to convince you of it and make it easier for you to digest it. Whereas the ESV, it's like, yeah, we know why you're here. Just open it up and read it. The CSB is like, no, come on in. We got good information for you here. It's like the study Bible equivalent of a greens smoothie from Jamba Juice. Like you're getting your daily dose of fruits and vegetables, but it's in a fun and a tasty way kind of a thing. That's the way I feel when I hold this Bible and read this Bible. So that's again, they both make different impressions for sure. But if I have to determine a winner in this category, I'm going to have to give it to the CSB Everyday Bible. I think it just presents itself in a more user-friendly, kind of easier to engage with way. So there you have it. That's the Bible comparison. So let's add up the scores here, and then we'll crown a winner. So in what seems like a rather lopsided victory, I would say that the CSB Study Bible is the winner of this comparison. Now, of course, none of this may matter to you if you just want an inexpensive, study note packed ESV Bible, then that's going to be the clear winner for you. And it's a good choice. They're both wonderful Bibles. Now, as I told you at the start that I would mention, which one I ultimately landed on when making this decision for myself. So I went with the CSB Everyday Study Bible. Now, I actually purchased the bonded leather version for myself, but I will just mention that I do think that there is value to some of these inexpensive Bibles. I would encourage people to maybe look at these if you're considering what you want a study Bible to be for. And the reason I think these can be valuable and the right choice for you, even if you can afford the more expensive one, is because now I'm not a big note taker, Bible marker upper, but I would be far more likely to mark up a $12 paperback ESV Concise Study Bible and kind of make it my own than I would be and will be with the leather bound, 50 or, there's some of those, Bibles that $200-$300 Bibles, right? You're far more likely to just sort of use this for what its intended purpose is, which is getting into it, studying it, marking it up, making notes, taking it with you everywhere, than you would be with a very expensive Bible. So I think there's some value, even to, again, a $17, pretty nice, pretty sturdy Bible in this leather touch CSB Everyday. So there is value to the lower price. I ultimately went with the bonded leather. We'll see if I come to regret that, but that's the one I chose. But, ultimately, I just found the CSB Everyday Study Bible to be, it's just a more enjoyable Bible for me to read, more enjoyable Bible to use, more enjoyable to look at. And I already have an ESV Study Bible. I have plenty of ESV LSB, the Legacy Standard Bible, which are both word for word. So I have a lot of word for word translation Bibles in my house. I don't really need another one. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to reading through this kind of easier, optimal equivalence, whatever you want to call it, sort of thought for thought light or word for word loose translation of the CSB. So that's ultimately what I chose. Now, I know that was a lot to cover, and this was a longer video than most, but I really wanted to give you as much information as I can because buying a Bible, it should be a big deal. It should be an important thing for you. And I want to give you as much information as I can to help you make the right decision. So if this video did help you out, maybe consider helping me out by dropping a like on the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't. I do want to have more of these Bible review, just Christian book reviews coming out because it's something I really enjoy. I love Bibles. I love Christian books and all those sorts of things. So do that and it would help me out a lot. And if you are going to purchase one of these Bibles or any other Bible, maybe consider using my link down in the show notes. Those are affiliate links and they will just help me, to continue making content like these. Not every Bible is $12. Some of them are a little more pricey. So that would certainly help me out a lot. And then lastly, if you do decide to buy one of these Bibles, please let me know down in the comments which one you chose and why. That would not only be helpful for me, but I think would be helpful for anyone else who's coming to this video looking to make the same decision, because you may not view these Bibles the same way I did, right? This is subjectively objective or objectively subjective, however we decided on that. So let me know which one you chose and why. I'd be very interested in hearing about that, and I'm sure others would be as well. But that's all I have for now. But remember, before I go, Don't just buy a Bible, read the darn thing. All right, God bless.